this is a community discussion. This isn't anything overly formal. So anybody who wants to chime in and share their thoughts and speak about what's happening in the open source community, the OpenTofu community, is welcome to request to speak. We'll be more than happy to hear from our entire community. So, all right, as we kick off our space, and I'm not the biggest space expert, so give me some leniency here. Actually, crashed the first link, so let's hope we don't crash and burn with this one too. But yeah, we're gathered here today to mark a very significant milestone in the evolution of open source. I historically have been known to be an outspoken open source advocate with posts in the news stack and things when OpenSearch dropped and other things. And I've had opinions on the sustainability of open source, on the changing of business licenses and other trends that are impacting the world of open source. And if you've been involved in the DevOps, cloud native, open source community space, like our panelists who are joining us, and I'll introduce shortly, it was very hard to miss a major moment for our community, which was the changing of the HashiCorp open source license from MPL version 2 to BSL version 1.1 in August, which is source available, I believe, were considered less open source. And HashiCorp has historically been kind of the poster child of open source. So this was a major moment. And out of this came the OpenTofu project, which is essentially the Terrafrom fork. In August, it was forked, and then it was contributed to the Linux Foundation, if I'm correct, in September. You can find all of that historical information on opentofu.org. And other folks have been covering it too. We have Ohad Maislish from N0 who posted about it, and Dotan Horovitz, who's on this call, also posted about the forking of the project. And here we are a few months later, and we're thrilled to announce that OpenTofu is now generally available. It was GA'd today, so congrats to everyone who contributed. Woo! Woohoo! Yes, this is a big milestone. It was an incredible journey. Really incredible to see this project GA'd so quickly. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what it takes to build a successful open source project, the trials and tribulations of open source, and we have an incredibly esteemed panel with us and folks that we'd love to have chime in. So as we get started, let's introduce our panelists, or the ones that are here with us. We have a few more that are supposed to be joining. I see that Andrew actually is here, so he's been invited to speak. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce the folks that are going to be on the panel today, and other folks are welcome to join and chime in. So Dotan Horovitz, tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey in the open source space, and why you're excited about OpenTofu. Dotan, come in. All right, then we're going to go to Ohad and then Dotan. Ohad.
Yeah, I need to unmute. Maybe that's the issue. So hi, everybody. Great seeing you all here. My name is Ohad Maislish, co-founder and CEO at N0. We are from 2 hours after the license change announcement of HashiCorp started working on OpenTF, then OpenTofu. And I'm extremely, extremely excited that today our boy is going to high school or a university or something like that, graduated, and now being part of a mature community of successful open source projects. It's a very important day for the open source community.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think this is a huge milestone. I think some of us open source folks were a little bit skeptical when we first heard about OpenTofu, but this journey has been truly remarkable. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Anders Eknert, who is from Styra. And Styra are the folks behind OPA, right? Open Policy.
Yeah, that's right. So
tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of your journey also in the open source space, a little bit behind your work for the CNCF and OPA and other.
Yeah, sure. So I've been involved in the OPA project for at least 4 years, I think almost 5. Started out looking for something to solve authorization, and I kind of saw OPA at the KubeCon in Barcelona. Was it 2019, I think? and continued on that path ever since. So yeah, and of course, like my relationship with Terrafrom or OpenTofu also comes from kind of from that angle, since OPA has been like, and still is pervasive. It's basically everywhere in the IaC community. So I'd say we're the policy engine of choice for most people working with Terraform or OpenTofu. So yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Dotan, are you ready? We keep losing Dotan. Okay, welcome back. Andrew, on to you from ControlPlane, CEO, and also deeply involved in the CNCF community. Love to hear a little bit more about your journey and thoughts and other things.
Good evening from London. I've been a long-term Terraform user. I've been deeply technical throughout my career, and the advent of infrastructure as code in a declarative sense, as opposed to this balance between declarative and procedural, always swings one way or the other. Terraform turned up and gave us something to base security, static analysis, and ultimately a more effective way of detecting configuration drift. And it has become such a centralized part of so many deployments that seeing this community reaction, seeing the open source advocates gather around and jump on what is ultimately probably one of the quickest release cycles in the history of software in general, especially something that is considered critical to so many organizations, is astounding. Super stoked to see this linchpin of so many different organizations back to being open source, not just open, what was it, source available, I think is the new framing. Open source involves freedom. Free and open source is what we dedicate our careers and our spare time to. So very, very pleased and very happy to be here.
Amazing. And Dotan, do we have you now? Are you there? Woohoo! All right, we got Dotan. And Dotan is an avid podcaster, so I expect him to give us a really good opening. And so Dotan doesn't need much introduction, but I personally am proud of Dotan as our personal CNCF ambassador out of Tel Aviv. So take it away, Dotan.
Great to be here, and I've been following this project since its initiation, and so excited. I think, as said before me, it's incredibly fast to reach from the original, not even the fork, even the manifesto when it came out, all the way through to GA, especially through also teaming up with the foundation. And I'm also a CNCF ambassador, so knowing the foundations inside and out, it comes with its merits, but also with its bureaucracy and the process. So crossing this chasm as well, and being able to achieve the GA within the Linux Foundation as a foundational open source, that's a tremendous achievement. So way to go, everyone.
So yes, really excited to have everyone here. And yes, we're going to touch a little bit on everything that's involved with getting an open source project from theory to GA, especially in a foundation model, which also has its own challenges. But I think just to kick it off, I think I'm just even going to read from the OpenTofu GA blog post today, just a little bit about the things that were released, the new features and things to look forward to. And then I'm going to ask Ohad, who's actually an integral part of the project, and he can also identify anybody in the crowd who's contributing to the project, to maybe tell us a little bit about what was involved with rolling out all of this, and what's coming next, and what to look forward to, and all of that. So just to quickly quote from the blog post, the new features being released in OpenTofu 1.6.0. That comes with a bunch of new stuff. So there's the testing feature that lets you test your OpenTofu configurations and lets module authors test those modules, which is awesome. The S3 state backend, which is a big deal, which the community was really looking forward to. So that's pretty awesome. And the new provider and module registry, which follows a homebrew-like architecture and is fully based on a Git repository. So very cool stuff coming out in the very first GA. Want to unpack those a little for us, Ohad, and tell us a little bit about why those are exciting, what went into building those, and what we can look forward to in next versions.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely, Sharon. I think what the community have seen today is the ability to deliver. It's very important to gradually and carefully build credibility with the community. And everything you mentioned, I think, is extremely important for us to prove that we deliver as a new entity. For us, it was a new experience to join other amazing companies. I'd like to shout out some of our official competition, but here we collaborate extremely well in the behalf of this project. Spacelifts, Scalar, Harness. Grant work is also very important to mention, the folks behind Terra Grant and many others who decided to keep the Terrafrom ecosystem open source forever. I think maybe even more important than what we are doing here in OpenTofu is to see other projects and other companies embrace OpenTofu. I think very important projects are Alpine and Brew. So if you're using Mac and you use Brew install in order to install your software, Brew install now supports OpenTofu and actually limits the Terraform installation to the latest open source, which is 1.7. So everybody is using Brew. If you write Brew install Terraform, you get 1.5. If you write Brew install OpenTofu, you get 1.6 and later 1.7 and so on and so on. So I think it's very important to see not just what's going on within the OpenTofu project, but in the entire ecosystem and how everybody is going with the trajectory of open source, and not like what Andrew said earlier. He mentioned the source available, which is kind of a new concept that was being used. And I think the power of open source compared to source available, exactly as Andrew mentioned, is now something that we can all see the results of it.
Incredible. That's awesome. So we'll get to what's coming next also. That's all really exciting. And I agree that delivery is extremely important. I'd like to tap into our other panelists, and I guess you guys can just chime in whenever you think. What do you think about kind of the forks that have come out of the HashiCorp change? So one is OpenTofu. That was GA today. There's also OpenVal from IBM. And how do you see this all playing out? Happy to hear your thoughts, Anders, because you're unmuted anyway.
Was I unmuted?
Yeah, but it's fine. You weren't making any
Okay.
noise, so.
I think, like as Anders said, it's an exciting development. Always been like a strong supporter of open source, and it's to me, it's like this whole community aspect. I understand like organizations need to make money as well, but it just didn't sit right with me with this whole kind of change of license. No matter, like, I know it's in their full right, but I think to kind of to build a community on the premise of open source and then kind of pull that rug, it didn't sit right with me. And so I'm very excited to see that like these projects continuing on an open source trajectory, although under different stewardship. So super excited about it, even though I'm not currently like a big user on any of these projects, but I'm definitely involved in the larger ecosystem around them. So very excited, and big congratulations to everyone involved.
Amazing, thank you. I'm just going to say that I dropped a poll in the thread of the space. So whoever wants to chime in, we're going to drop some polls throughout, just so we can see kind of what the community is using and what their thoughts are, and whether you're considering migrating. Dotan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on you guys kind of at Logs.io, and as the CNCF ambassador and an open source person in the community, have also undergone other similar stories with Elasticsearch and their change of licenses. I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of that evolution in this space and what's happening and what you see going forward.
Yeah, so by the way, can you hear me better now? Fix the device.
Yep, can hear you.
So yeah, we've been through that also with my current company, with Logs.io, more than once. You mentioned with Elasticsearch, that was quite an adventure. And then also with Grafana, change of license, different type of change of license within the open source realm, but to a copyleft type of license, which is another beast there, and some others. So definitely been through this cycle a few times before. And by the way, for those who don't know, with Elasticsearch, it also ended up with a fork called OpenSearch. So similar, but also different in some respects. So I think it's something that I expect us to see not less of this year, now that we're at the beginning of 2024. It is something that seems to be a trend, a defensive way of companies as soon as they reach a certain maturity level to switch over from open source. Obviously, I'm saying that with regret, being an open source ambassador, but it seems to be sort of something, I don't know if it's the pressure from the venture capital world or the financial situation or what, but on the other hand, I think the encouraging thing is to see the community stepping up, and this is an incredible opportunity. Ohad mentioned that you can actually see competitors on the commercial side of the house then teaming up and joining forces to keep, in this case, Terrafrom open. This is the power of open source, the ability to bring together different vendors and also end users, and we've seen Harness and others joining later on in the OpenTofu realm, and building up in an incredible pace. Like really, less than half a year to reach stability is incredible. So I think the most important thing is to realize this is something that is not sporadic. We've seen that with Akka, by the way, and others, each one with his own domain. And I think we need to, as users also, as end users, for those out there, when you evaluate open source, when you use open source, to do that with this in mind, just like you take other considerations in mind when you choose an open source and use it, like security and operability and other things. This should also be part of your evaluation, part of your way of creating automations, guardrails, and so on.
Interesting. We'll tap into it a little bit in a little bit, but I also would want to hear your thoughts on kind of what OpenTofu can learn from the OpenSearch fork and other kind of things that you've learned on the way. But I'd love to hear your take, Andrew, as well, like what you're seeing, what you're thinking, how do you feel about forks, and what do you expect to happen going forward kind of in the open source ecosystem?
I am all for forks. We saw the same kind of thing happened with Node.js, maybe 2016, I guess, where Node.js was already managed in a community sense. So it was truly a community project, that the stewardship was agreed by committee. There were the structures in place that actually, with OpenTofu under the Linux Foundation, the advantages in terms of open governance and freedom of contribution, vendor neutrality, they were all broadly there in the Node.js world, but there were some fundamental differences, and there was an IO.js fork. Now, that really brought into sharp relief the differences between the two groups of maintainers, and they were able to go forward. This was on a technical basis, incidentally, not a license. They were able to go forward and then reunify the code bases and join the contributors back up and essentially maintain and bring the velocity of the project onwards. So forking can be very useful in some cases. In this case, looking at OpenBow, it's an interesting one. Vault is I keep on using the term critical, but Vault is such a critical part of so many secrets management solutions. And for regulated industries, especially, the cost of deploying a Vault cluster is north of $100,000. And that's, while there's a small amount of extra enterprise feature sparkles on top, actually, for something so critical that a lack of availability will take down production and give you the expiry length of your keys before everything is inoperable, then I suspect banks will continue to pay for those licenses because they get direct access to HashiCorp support. So OpenBow, I think, has a lot more necessary conviction just because it's such a mission critical piece of infrastructure. More broadly, I mean, when we see these license change escapades where we have a vibrant community, we have people contributing in advocating, building tutorials, giving their free time into the project. And then we see this concept of, well, we're going to change the license. It's free for you to use until you start making money from your startup. That seems like a bait and switch to the entire open source community. It's interesting to compare this to the Elastic and Grafana pieces, because in those cases, we saw major cloud providers rehosting those projects and barely contributing back upstream, not being good open source contributors in general, and making hundreds of millions of dollars from direct competition. In this case, these forks have happened, I think, well before competitors have made significant money at that kind of quantum from Terrafrom in general, and HashiCorp certainly makes a lot of money from licensing vaults. So it does make you wonder if this is now a VC-backed play, as Dotan alluded to. There's also some of the comments made straight out at the top of HashiCorp suggest that they don't really understand that the inherent success of these projects has been brought about by the open source ecosystem. And had it not been open source, they would probably not have got to this point. So big fan of forks. OpenTofu is probably the most successful that has ever driven stratospherically to that number of stars. OpenBow sort of remains to be seen. Interested to see how that progresses.
Yes, and I think there's also something to be said about kind of the companies that are backing the initiative. And I think that OpenSearch was actually quite successful because it had quite a strong corporate backing from a bunch of companies from Labs.io to AWS and others. And OpenTofu also has commitment of resources and time, and you can see that in the delivery. And so OpenBow, now that was forked by IBM, we have to see where it's going to go. And so I agree, it is yet to be seen how that's going to play out. But one thing that I actually, the parallel here for me.
Sharon, if I might just chime in, for OpenBow, it's actually even more interesting because I thought IBM as the corporate, as the company. This is a group within IBM that engages in another open source project under the Linux Foundation, and actually found themselves in a very awkward position when the change occurred, when Vault license change occurred, that they couldn't no longer use that within their own project. So they needed to find an alternative, and they ultimately went down the path of actually forking and creating this alternative. So this is actually something that is really, really the classic bottoms up, almost individuals, although they're IBM employees. So I'm just saying it's not IBM as IBM. Interesting to see if IBM takes more formal position in this, and obviously if others join. But this is the case that also exemplifies very well that this relicensing is also a problem, not just for commercial organizations that make money out of these projects, and therefore, and obviously also blamed for maybe playing unfair. This is actually a problem for the open source community itself, because if I'm and in the CNCF we see that broadly, because in the CNCF the policy is largely around Apache 2.0. And if any dependency, doesn't matter if it's a library or a tool or anything else, does not adhere to this license, even by the way within the realms of other OSI approved licenses, it's still a problem. And then other open source projects found themselves imposed, especially if it's a copyleft license, by constraints that they haven't chosen. So I'm just saying, very, very interesting case that just shows the complexity of this new situation that we're coming into.
Wow, I had no idea. And so that's why I always love to have you on these sorts of spaces. That's new information for me. I had no idea. And that's actually a really good point that you bring up, that those dependencies are cascading. And then the outcomes, everything that happens around these sort of license changes that has so many, it has so much impact. I'd love to actually tap into Anders and Andrew as well, who are both have, I guess, popular open source projects and hosted in the CNCF. Andrew, yours is a sandbox project still, or am I wrong about that? Am I right? I don't remember. But Andrew's OPA is actually graduated, right? It's a long-standing graduated project. Tell us a little bit about the trials and tribulations of having a CNCF ideas and practices.
Sure. Yeah. So we graduated 2 years ago, I think, which was after quite a long process of I don't remember all the steps, but there was a long list of requirements and things you had to do, things you had to prove, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that took a lot of hard work and effort, but it was obviously worth it. So we've been, I think, I don't know when it became like when it joined the CNCF. That is before my time, and I think like the level of kind of collaboration or so on depends a lot, but differs a lot between different projects. I think at this stage or at this point in time, we were quite like independently from the CNCF, but obviously it's good to have the backing of that, and it, I think the main thing where I notice it is around KubeCon, the conferences where it really helps being a graduated project. But I think it depends a lot. Like some of these projects they do, like if they do a webinar, they do it under the CNCF or hosted by CNCF. If they write a blog, they write it on under the CNCF properties and so on. So it really depends a lot of, or it really differs a lot between projects, how much you can work with the CNCF and how much you don't. I think we could probably be better in our collaboration with that, but it's never been like anything anyone regretted. I think it's been a fruitful collaboration, I think.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Andrew, what are your thoughts? And just correct me if I'm wrong. Do you guys have a hosted CNCF project? Am I right about that?
We do not, as a result of seeing how much effort it is to maintain things in open source. We've got a flurry of bits of open source security tooling around Kubernetes and network testing and the like. But actually, most of the work that I do in this space is via tag security. We've got Eddie Knight here as well, who is a collaborator there. And the goal of tag security is to help to assess and recommend security practices to projects that are looking to ascend through the CNCF's governance process. This is, again, one of the key points of having vendor neutrality and foundational membership, which is that the way we proceed with these is a community of people external to the project coming through have a high-level demo. They'll then go and dig into the docs. They will use the project, and they will build out what they believe is the beginnings of security assessment, take it back to the project, and then collaborate on a joint assessment, which is then submitted to the technical oversight committee and is used as one of the barriers of maturity in order for that project to ascend through the ranks. This is one of the, as I say, major delineations between running something as an open source project which sits on GitHub with a closed sponsor panel actually sort of funding the developers doing the work, and ultimately with complete control and the ability to make these kind of license changes, and something that sits in a foundation. So the way that the Linux Foundation and specifically the CNCF governs these projects is, in order for something to graduate, there must be evidence of multiple contributors from multiple different companies, evidence of community, impartiality, the things that we almost take for granted in these well-curated communities that would go a long way to, for example, robustifying, not that the project necessarily needs it, but the Terrafrom open source code, and also offering a direct path of mitigation in cases such as this. Now, actually, OpenTofu went straight into the Linux Foundation. They reached out and were welcomed with open arms. So we can now look forward to that kind of stewardship for the project.
Yeah, fantastic. Actually, this is where I would want to tap into Ohad and kind of ask him a little bit about his experience with contributing, with being on the team that contributed OpenTofu to the Linux Foundation, some of the challenges you encountered, and what do you think will impact your stewardship of this project and the other companies involved in terms of navigating it through this through the Linux Foundation. So Ohad, I'd love to hear a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. I think we're all positioned in the ideal situation here. We already have a very mature ecosystem of providers. Let's say the AWS provider, which is open source, the Datadog and Okta providers, and so on and so on. The modules, all of the AWS modules and other modules already existing as open source, they already work as is with OpenTofu. So we are already in a very good place to continue and support this project. Besides the resources of OpenTofu, as I mentioned, the providers and modules, there are other things that work hand in hand. OPA is a great example that works with Terrafrom, and same with OpenTofu. InfraCost for cost estimation, Chekhov, TFSec, Terrascan. So OpenTofu is a unique example of something that from day one already has a very mature ecosystem of adjacent solutions and technologies. So that's really important to mention when we think about the future of such a project, to look at it in that context. Another thing I think it's really important to share with our audience is how OpenTofu works as a project. So besides just announcing 1.6 GA, another thing that the team had to do is to create the alternative for the Terrafrom registry. Not sure if you're all aware, but a few days after the license change of Terrafrom framework itself, the HashiCorp also announced, or actually they didn't announce, but they just changed the terms and conditions of the Terrafrom registry. And the beautiful thing that happened is that in OpenTofu, there were, if I remember correctly, 4 ideas, different ideas, on how to implement the new registry, the open registry that anybody can use without any limitations. And we went to the community and did RFC, request for comments, and we gave about 10 or 14 days for everybody to try to suggest how they think the new registry should be implemented, and we acted accordingly. We have a technical steering committee, and everything is so transparent and impartial and community driven. So I think now that we see that we have all of those foundations within this project, I am 1000% assured that this will continue in the right direction, working hand in hand with the community.
That's awesome. That's really incredible. Incredible work to everyone who contributed to this. We have some really awesome folks in the audience, and I said that this is going to be a community discussion. So for those who would like to chime in and kind of give your thoughts on what you think about kind of what's happening in the OpenTofu kind of ecosystem, or even the CNCF landscape, and a little bit on the OpenTofu GA dropping. If you want to chime in, feel free to request to speak. We'd love to hear what everyone in the community thinks about this milestone. So as we wait for community folks to want to join our conversation, I also will add that I added another poll in our chat here. I just want to see like kind of what people are thinking in terms of migrating to OpenTofu. So there's another poll about maybe your what you're considering, and if it's even in the plan as to adopt OpenTofu sometime soon or migrate to OpenTofu. So Eddie Knight, thanks for joining us. I see that you requested to speak. Feel free to let us know what you're thinking about the OpenTofu community and maybe adoption, or in general kind of the new project, and what are your thoughts and experiences?
Yeah. Hey. So in addition to collaborating with Andrew inside of CNCF, I'm a maintainer for Finos, which is another Linux foundation focused on financial services. It's a financial services vertical. So I used to work inside of a couple different major investment banks, and now I work for Sonatype. We're open source security. But because I'm still a maintainer for the Finos organization, I'm doing a lot of work related to infrastructure deployment for financial services. The interesting thing for me is that there hasn't been a strong response
to the license change, but there has been a lot of strong interest, especially in the potential for reducing spend on things such as Terraform Enterprise. And so I was curious if anybody wanted to spend a few seconds just kind of giving an update or kind of casting vision for OpenBow, if that's something that we could talk about a little bit.
Sure. I don't consider myself very knowledgeable, but it sounds like Dotan knows a little bit about OpenBow. So feel free to go for it, Dotan, if you have answers there.
Well, first of all, I'm not a security expert, I think here actually Andrew and others, but so from the security angle and the best approach, obviously, but in terms of the open source path, I think the challenge there is, as I said, that there's still no major entity that stepped up to address. So it's I guess a side benefit is the fact that since it came out of a project that is under the Linux Foundation or under the LF Edge, for those who know Linux Foundation Edge that discusses these technologies. So in a way, it's by definition somehow under the umbrella of the Linux Foundation, but it's very technical administrative aspect. In the real sense, I think it still needs to be to prove itself that other join, and similar dynamics as we've seen very successfully here with OpenTofu, with vendors that are deeply vested, that actually put full-time engineering, development resources, and other types of resources, marketing, and so on, to make it successful. This is, I think, from my experience with open source and also looking at my capacity within the CNCF, a core pillar of the sustainability of projects, let alone in the very early stages when it's really trying to make its first steps in the world, is about creating this momentum and later on the diversity. So it's great to see that with OpenTofu and with OpenBow we're way earlier in the stages, and we need to see, even if, as I said, even if IBM itself as a corporate will back it up formally, and not just these individuals that are involved through the OpenLF, the LF Edge project. That's my take on the open source. But if you're talking about like feature set and capabilities around the security, I'll leave it for the security experts here in the crowd.
No, that answers my question very, very well. I think the biggest focus is more on what is the trajectory for this whole ecosystem, right? To be able to enable the adoption at those higher level organizations that are looking for that full feature set. And so this step today is huge. And I'm wondering what's next. And I think you just answered that really clearly. Thank you.
Sure.
Awesome. Thanks so much for chiming in, Eddie, and thanks for that excellent answer, Dotan. We have other folks in the audience. I'm not going to out you, but you know who you are, that are security experts. If you feel like you want to chime in and kind of give your perspective there, you're more than welcome. We also have folks from the IaC space that are here, and if they have thoughts also on kind of the way this is all playing out, we'd love to have you chime in. Ooh, do we have someone interesting join us? Anton, I'm so happy you're here. Maybe just as a listener, but Anton always has good insights on everything that's happening in the IaC space. So Anton, if you're looking to chime in and want to add some perspective, you're more than welcome. I think one of the things that a lot of folks are probably asking, and this goes to everyone kind of on the panel, Ohad, probably because you're inside the project, but Dotan is the CNCF ambassador, and Andrew and Anders. But what do you think would be involved? Even this is even almost a DevOps question, I guess, an IaC question. What is involved with migrating to OpenTofu, and what is the likelihood? What are the barriers or the blockers for people to actually start adopting OpenTofu? What do you think needs to kind of happen in order for this to gain a little bit more momentum in terms of more so like kind of what Eddie was speaking about, enterprise adoption versus like open source projects and things like that, which I also think is already impressive as it is, that some projects are already moving ahead and adopting OpenTofu, but in terms of more widespread adoption, I guess.
Yeah. So the beautiful thing is that those organizations actually don't need to do anything in order to start using OpenTofu. It's the same protocol, it's the same kind of language that is Terrafrom. I remember Kelsey Hightower writing in his Twitter posting in his Twitter after we announced the fork that it's like HTTP protocol in browsers. You have different browsers that implement the same protocol. I think all in all, you will see now with the GA more and more adoption of using an open source framework binary that is fully compatible, that has no legal risk whatsoever, and adopted by the community. And as time goes by, we're going to see more and more innovation and more community driven involvement in this project, and this will gradually bring more and more enterprises. By default, enterprises are in wait and see mode, and I think TerraGrant and OPA are great examples of amazing open sources that were created by and supported not by AWS or IBM, but just by a smart group of people, and enterprises gradually implemented those technologies in production. So I'm sure that we're going to see the same here, because unlike migrating from Terrafrom to Pulumi or from Terrafrom to CrossPlane, which is a lot of work and education for the engineers that need to learn different concepts and different providers and to be aware of so many different technologies, to migrate, I'm not sure that's the right word, to migrate from Terrafrom to OpenTofu basically means just execute a different command.
Interesting. And do you think that there are going to be any concerns around, I guess, fragmentation going forward? At some point, I mean, it's called a fork because, I mean, it is kind of a fork in the road. Do you think that there's going to be a point at which, you know, it's not going to be backwards compatible with Terraform, or where there'll be those types of like kind of decisions that you'll need to make?
Yeah, so I think it's important to remind us all that Terraform is already 9 years old. If you just look at the GitHub insights of this project, you're going to see a lot of development in the past. But in the last few years, it has been a pretty stable project. So there is actually not that much complexity in order to continue pushing this project forward. And I think whatever happens in Terraform, which makes sense for the community will push forward the right decisions for OpenTofu. So I believe that it will be compatible plus, meaning it will, whatever is needed in Terraform will exist in OpenTofu thanks to our developers in the community. And more than that, for example, state encryption, I think is a very, very interesting example of something that is, let's say, probably coming to OpenTofu sooner than Terraform. And that's due to the fact that we have fabulous folks from the community who just wanted to put that inside OpenTofu. And it makes sense to have this capability in this framework. So we're going to see, I think, both compatibility and additional innovation in case you want to use specific capabilities of OpenTofu. I think it's a very reasonable challenge for us behind OpenTofu, because as I mentioned, it's not as complicated as it used to be a few years ago. And also, if we look at the providers, AWS provider, Azure provider, AWS and Azure always have new resources, so you always have to work in order to maintain those providers due to the innovation of the cloud vendors themselves. In Terraform framework, in Terraform core, the situation is different. AWS innovation doesn't affect the capabilities of Terraform core. Terraform core just has its own innovation. And again, as I mentioned, it's 9 years old, it's very mature. So my personal opinion is that we're going to see both compatibility due to the reasonable challenge that we have here and innovation coming from the community.
Very interesting. I will, I mean, we're coming up towards the end of the session. I mean, we can keep going if we want, but I guess I was figuring it was going to be around an hour long. But what I would want to hear, if anybody from the, the community wants to chime in and tell us a little bit about what you're looking forward to seeing, if you have any questions regarding like kind of OpenTofu and what's coming next, and anything in the realms of that, like kind of what you'd like to see happening in the project, or what are your fears, or anything of that nature, you're more than welcome to chime in and kind of give us your thoughts. So don't be afraid to request to speak. But yeah, I guess I did want to come back to this question. So I feel like I asked in the context of the CNCF, so I'm going to direct this one to you, Dotan, but a little bit about what OpenTofu can learn from other forked projects. Like, you've been very experienced in what you said, like OpenSearch and Grafana and all of that kind of landscape. If you have a few tips for the OpenTofu maintainers and things to pay attention to.
Certainly. So first of all, I think many other forks can learn from OpenTofu. As I said, like the speed and very early on identifying that the path through foundational open source were very keen insights. OpenSearch, just as an example, up till now more veteran and still has not joined a foundation and is opening up slower than that. So definitely these are success stories. I think the diversity, I touched about and I alluded to that before, is very important, and the mix, a healthy mix between vendors and end users is something I think I highlighted that earlier in OpenTofu's journey as well in one of my tweets. But essentially making sure that it's not just vendors discussing between themselves and mitigating needs of their own respective products into the project, but rather also factoring in directly the end users and making them an essential part of that. I think these are the main things to the sustainability of the project and going forward. There was the initial statement, I think you touched a bit about that before in your questions, because the initial statement was about compatibility with Terraform, not just on the first version, but also going forward, like will be compatible as like a mission statement of OpenTofu or OpenTF as it was originally coined. And this is something that I was concerned about at the beginning. I told him it doesn't make sense to even claim that. These are going to be independent projects, and trying to create this tight coupling will actually cripple the project. So I'm glad to see now what Ohad said, a much more coherent message saying we will very discriminately examine the value of each of the features that is added to Terraform, and if it bears relevance to our community, then we'll see how to adapt it. I think, by the way, a great example with the testing capability that was added to Terraform at 1.6 that was obviously not being able to fork, but it was adapted to OpenTofu in this version. I think it's a good example as well. So I think these are the main things to make sure that the project goes on. And maybe worthwhile saying a few words if Ohad wishes to say about the roadmap ahead, what we expected. So now it's full alignment with 1.6, obviously, plus the things that were mentioned. But where do they see this heading forward? At least on the main themes would be maybe interesting for our audience.
Yeah, thanks, Dotan. Although I'm heavily involved supporting OpenTofu, I'm not in the in the technical steering committee and in the exact details. What I can say is that everything is fully transparent. We have weekly or bi-weekly updates in GitHub, on the website. We share things on our blog. We have a Slack community workspace with about 1,700 people asking questions and influencing the future of OpenTofu. So sorry for a political kind of answer, but I think it's not for me to personally share what's going on. There are official forums, governed forums with all the right process in order to make sure it's being handled properly by the leadership of this project.
It makes sense. And then anyway, maybe one more point that was interesting from the get-go, now that it's part of the Linux Foundation, I think from the get-go, the project aimed to actually join the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So this is yet another something that is interesting to see how the project evolves and how this converges. Actually, I saw just earlier today a post by Chris Anacek, the CTO of the CNCF, very enthusiastic and supportive of this major milestone. So hearing the executive leadership of the CNCF supportive of this is also encouraging. And I don't know if anyone here at the audience is involved enough to comment on this, but definitely both in my capacity on the CNCF, but also generally, I think the fit between Terraform and the cloud native ecosystem is lends itself to just being under the same foundation. Curious to see how this works out.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'd also be curious to hear. I see that there are folks in the audience who are on the technical teams. If you're interested in chiming in, Ronnie, I tried to give you speaker status, but you might not want it. You might not be in a position to speak, but I was hoping that you might want to actually chime in and tell a little bit more about the OpenTofu roadmap and what to look forward to on top of the things that Ohad said. But other than that, if not, then definitely do follow the community. There's the OpenTofu Twitter, X now, and the Slack that Ohad mentioned, and the website, we'll mention it again, opentofu.org. You can probably find all the information there and be able to track the project and get involved if you'd like to be more meaningfully involved and contribute to the project. And open source projects can always use more hands on deck, so I'm sure that they would be more than happy to have more contributors. I guess we'll wrap up with just some last thoughts on the infrastructure as code landscape itself and how it's evolved over the years. And even Ohad said, this project itself is 9 years old. I mean, I remember configuration management and Chef and Puppet and things and all that. And now we're on CDK. Now we're in all kinds of things. And I'm just wondering where it's all going and kind of what are your predictions for what's happening in the IaC landscape and where it's going to evolve from here. And I also have folks in the audience who I'd be happy to hear from. If you're interested in speaking up, please do request to speak. But yeah, let's just do a round of our panelists kind of and hear your thoughts on that. So Andrew, go right ahead.
Thanks. I wanted to chime in just on the previous point about HTTP of IaC. Essentially, while currently HCL is a commonality, if we look at the blog post that Dotan referenced from the Linux Foundation, they mentioned the 1.7 candidate features. So client-side state encryption, awesome. Transparent, that'll be great. Parameterizable backends provide us a module to enable more readable dry code. So that potentially means that a module in OpenTofu will not be compatible with Terraform. The nightmare situation for an enterprise is for HashiCorp to change the license on HCL. Now, it's not really clear whether that's even entirely possible, but potentially there's something there. That would then be a hard fork, and we'd be looking for maintainers and the community again to decide which way to go. I think everyone on this space is confident that the community would rally around the more open side of that fork. But this is broadly where I see the infrastructure as code piece going as well, because we have more or less standardized around the declarative nature of infrastructure configuration management. We generate a plan, we have the ability to run static analysis on it, and then we apply it to our cloud infrastructure. That is, compared to what we used to do, which was gaffer tape and string, even through, again, the procedural configuration management, we're in such a beautiful place compared to the beginning of my career and how I used to stand up and rack and stack servers. So IaC as a foundational piece to build the infrastructure for all the apps and systems that we use seems to have reasonably commoditized before this. My hope is that it maintains that stability because it is important for the systems currently running on it, and the ease of migration between forks at this point is a major selling point. I do wonder if HashiCorp will pull that card at some point in the future.
Yeah, interesting points. Anders, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Like one thing that struck me is like not just in the IaC space, but kind of the industry at large is, of course, like what impact does this fork and the OpenBow, these type of forks, now that we know, like that's probably what's going to happen. Like it must have a chilling effect on anyone else considering a license switch at this point, knowing that that's likely the outcome of doing this. So I feel like it's it has. I think this fork has benefits outside of even the IaC space. Just knowing that anyone considering this at this point must know now that this is a likely outcome. Like somebody is going to fork the project, and it's at one point it's bound to diverge, and there's going to be fragmentation, which is probably not what that the outlook of that, or like it's not as appealing as I'm sure, like I don't think HashiCorp saw this coming. I'm not sure if anyone knows, but so I could be wrong there, but now like anybody's going to see this coming, like this is, so I think there's I'm super excited about that, or just like this whole prospect of knowing, like, and what Andrew said, like forks are great, but obviously they're not great from the perspective of whoever wanted to pull the rug under the community and change something to a proprietary license. So it's obviously not a desirable outcome for them, and I'm very happy that this likely has a chilling effect on anyone else considering this.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I actually see that somebody from our community has accepted his speaker invitation. So Engin, I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of the evolution of the IaC space and what you see coming, and a little bit of thoughts going forward.
Yes, thanks first of all, Sharon, for organizing this great space. It's always interesting to hear what people in the same space think. First of all, a disclaimer, yes, I'm working for Pulumi, so I may be a little bit biased in some of my points. But I just wanted to continue what Anders mentioned, and I found this very interesting because this is something we at Pulumi could also feel was an increase of people looking around, let me say like this. So not saying, hey, I'm going to switch, but just started to re-evaluate the situation because there is now a uncertainty and fear what's going on with the tools they're using. So that's one of the things. So people start to ask the questions, or maybe redo the diligence they maybe missed before because they saw open source as always for granted, and hey, license change is something that cannot happen. So yes, we saw people coming with these concerns, or coming and say, hey, we're going to use now the opportunity with this license change to look around, to create a new shortlist of possible other solutions. That was one of the things. And I think the whole licensing change made the situation that people, when they decide for something new, they look a little bit more deeper. It even went so far that our CEO, Joe, for example, he presented a YouTube video where he had to assure the people to say, hey, Pulumi, as for now, will stay open source, is open source in its core. There's nothing planned, any license changes and so on, because people asked about this, and everything what we sometimes said, like, yeah, you're going to be the next, So that's a thing I saw. So a little bit shaking on the culture of people, how they consumed before open source tools. So people are now aware there are different licenses, and people are aware that there can be a license change, and they are looking more during their evaluation of tools, which license is underneath, because not every open source license, as we saw now, is the same, and could even have an impact of some of the companies. Who do I talk? I mean, Ohad with M0 and so on. They saw this firsthand. What could it mean for a company when a license of a core element of their business model changed? So just some insight from me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Actually, one thing that I recall seeing when the license changed, in the same way that Dotan mentioned OpenBow, and that eventually was just because they had that dependency that they literally had to fork the project in order to continue a different project. I even saw in the security space, and maybe this is something that Andrew can attest to after we just finished this specific question, but that they were even considering it almost like a supply chain attack. Once your license changes and you have this dependency, and you suddenly have this package that's in your that's tightly coupled in your stack, it really can wreak havoc. So it's interesting to see how those sorts of things can be perceived and impact an engineering stack that's running and in production when these things are pulled out from under you. So all of these points are really interesting. I'm going to ask Dotan and Ohad to chime in, and then I want to hear also what Nati Shalom has to say about all of this, because I see that he has accepted the invitation to speak, and I always like Nati Shalom's insights as well. So go ahead, Dotan, tell us your thoughts.
I think that what Engin said is very, very true. I think looking now not as maintainers or open source enthusiasts, but as plain users, the vast majority just use, again, libraries or tools in their day-to-day, and it's very important to get into the usage in a more mature fashion. And we do thorough evaluation of tools for many respects, and the performance and the cost and the security is now much more conscious. People are more conscious of security aspect. This should be one of the elements as well. I don't say it's the most important, but it is a different element that seems to be not top of mind for everyone. And it's not just the license. So license people by now are already fairly familiar with open source licensing. It's fine, but look beyond the licensing. Look and ask additional questions like who's behind the open source. If you see a single entity behind an open source, we saw what could happen. We saw that it could flip on you, and also ask what's the governance policy. The governance policy is the thing that will determine who can change the license, or many other things, and who can be promoted. How can people be promoted to contributors, to maintainers, to approvers, to whatnot, and all this process and the transparency around that. So it's very important to ask these questions from the get-go, and understand if you have two options, two open source tools that are equally on the same level in other respects, this should definitely be a factor for your decision. So just to make sure, and obviously when you use the tool, still also use it wisely. So just like when you, in security, you manage your third-party licensing exposure, you need to, your security exposure, you should do the same with the licensing exposure. We mentioned like copyleft licenses that can be can spread virally to your code. So you need to understand that and mitigate that. You need to take care with automation, for example, so that you don't automatically upgrade. We all love automations. We're all engineers, but if you upgrade and then suddenly the license change and you haven't put guardrails in that process, suddenly within this automation, you find yourself adopting a license that you didn't plan on just because of the automation. So lots of things that I would say, make sure that it's in your day-to-day engineering activity, both when deciding on choosing a tool and when using it in your day-to-day.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. Ohad, if you don't mind, I'm going to let Nati chime in because I'd love to hear what he has to say. First of all, also on the future of open source. I'm so happy you're here, Nati. First of all, welcome. And also like a little bit on the future of IaC, open source. And I historically remember you kind of saying things around predicting kind of the end of Terrafrom as the golden hammer. That was kind of how you phrased it. And I thought that was a really interesting phrasing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on everything that's played out since then.
Yeah, so I think he also, by the way, do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Excellent. Okay, I'm new to this platform. It's actually pretty nice. Anyway, I think what you also remember is the saying, the only constant is change. That I think was also on our shirts and whatever, and I think it applies here as well. I heard a lot of examples of open source, I think, project that was mentioned here. One thing that I didn't hear is Docker, and I think those who are remember the days of Docker and how it started in a storm and looked like the only constant is not change, that it's going to be there forever, can look and see even how much a dominant project, a very successful one, can be too successful. And there is something that is called too successful. And I think the case of Terrafrom really reminds me of that example.
Yeah. Hang on, we lost you there for a second. You there? Yeah, there we go.
I'm saying there is something that is called being too successful. Docker is a great example for that. And I think Terraform is very closely, I think, in that on path of too many companies, pretty big companies and pretty big projects, that the I would say the force of fork, so to speak, is almost inevitable. And the same thing that happened with Docker when they became greedy, and wanted to move up the stack and kind of dictate how things will work. That force of fork became stronger and stronger, with joining Google, that actually created another project which is called Kubernetes, which kind of killed Swarm and so forth. So I think there's enough gravity to create a momentum. What I think the community needs to realize is that it's going to take time to build that momentum, and there needs to be a patient. For patient, and that's the second point, you need funding. And I think one of the things that I think we're still lacking is a good business model behind those open source projects, because what we're seeing is that every time that there is a successful open source, it becomes greedy and therefore change license. And that kind of makes a lot of people relatively skeptic about the nature of open source as it appeared in that. So I think I'm hoping that something that out of this OpenTofu experience is also a better business model that I think would be viable for both the maintainers that obviously need funding to maintain things. It doesn't come for free, but wouldn't really have to go through this greediness phase where everything becomes closed, etc. So that's my hope, and something to live with the community.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more. That something must be broken in the system if this is the outcome of all of these successful open source projects, and maybe we do need to rethink what that model actually looks like going forward. Ohad, I'll let you wrap it up and also give us some, some teasers looking forward in terms of the project, what we can expect in terms of the rollout, and I guess timeframes for releases, and just take it away and wrap up our space.
Sure. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, everybody. I would mainly like to echo what Dotan just said earlier. And for me, it was also a learning experience, because up until a few months ago, I thought open source is open source, or mostly open source. But I think now engineering leaders, when choosing new technologies to use that are open source, need to look at two other criteria. One is who is behind that legally licensed open source. Is it a company, or is it the CNCF, Linux Foundation, or something like that? Because that's totally different. There is no pull rugs if it's under the CNCF or the Linux Foundation. The second thing, if it's not under the Linux Foundation or CNCF or something like that, is how this project, open source project, behaves. So for example, a couple of years ago, in September 21, HashiCorp announced that they're no longer accepting community pull requests to Terrafrom core. So that's a huge signal of how this project is being managed. It was open source license back then, but it was not community driven. So after looking at both the license itself from a legal point of view, but also more importantly, the community aspect of how you can influence, how you can affect the progress of this project, and who controls this project, whether it's impartial within the Linux Foundation CNCF or not as impartial as you wanted it to be, because things can change, and we've learned that from HashiCorp license change and other license changes that were discussed here as well. So yeah, I think we all learned, and I think a lot of folks, a lot of engineers also learned a very important lesson, and will take the future decisions accordingly. And I think some things will change. Back to your question about the teasers and things like that. So again, it's not something that I am too special to ask. It's a community-driven project. The questions are being asked in those forums. So again, a boring answer to an important question is just to follow the official website, Slack channel, social media of OpenTofu, and learn from there exactly what's going on with the weekly updates. And this is how it should be done in the community. I don't have any important information that others don't have.
Fantastic. That's I guess that's the way it should be. I could go on all night talking about open source, one of the topics that are near and dear to my heart. But I guess we will wrap up. I am going to thank my co-host, Matan Buganim from N0, and Andrew Martin from ControlPlane, Dotan Horovitz from Logs.io, Ohad Maislish from N0, and Anders Eknert from Styra, and all of the speakers, Nati, Eddie, Engin, thank you so much for chiming in and being a meaningful part of our community. We will keep you posted, and you can definitely follow both myself, the TLV community, and the OpenTofu community for more updates. DevOps Days Tel Aviv, and any of those handles and communities, and get involved. We hope to be able to meet up in person sometime soon, and hopefully I'll see all of you on the community circuit. Thanks so much for being here. Have a good evening. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks to our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.